Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on informational interviewing. My name is Charlie Sumner. I'm your host from Center for Workplace Development, and with me today is Devin Ryder. Devin, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you, Charlie. So my name is Devin Ryder. I'm here at the Center for Workplace Development, where I've worked for quite a number of years in the career development area. And we have what I hope will be quite a lively interview on this today. Charlie, do you have anything to say about how this will work structurally?
Sure. What we're going to be doing, so everyone knows what's going on today, is that Devin and I are going to do a quick presentation on informational interviewing. She's going to lead the presentation. I might chime in with some questions here or there. We are going to be recording today's session, so everything that we discuss today will be available online afterwards at the Center for Workplace Development website on harvey.harvard.edu, as well as some supplemental documents. And if during the presentation, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen and send those to me directly, and we will answer them as we go through the presentation. Want to take it away, Devin?
I will. Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so I called this workshop the other kind of interview because I would say this is one of the most neglected or most misunderstood types of interviews and yet it's an extremely important step in people's career development. This type of interview can result in just an incredible amount of power to you in terms of researching your career. So let's get into it and talk about what we're going to cover, and move to the next slide, Charlie, if we can. Okay. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll look at a definition of what informational interviewing is and is not. Why should you put the work into this? Because it is work. There's no question about that. So why in the world should you do all this work to do an informational interview, and what can it do for you if you do the work? We'll look at what's expected of you. In other words, what role do you need to play? What role does the other person need to play? How is it different from a job interview? We'll look at how you prepare for it. We'll look at what to do and what not to do in an informational interview, and we'll look at surprises that can come up and how to handle them. We'll look at follow-up, and as Charlie mentioned earlier, please jot down your questions in the chat box at any time, and I think he's about to send you another little message saying the same thing, and we'll address them either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. So let's go on to the next slide. And the first thing I want to do is just define our terms. The other term that you could use to title this kind of interview is it's a research interview, essentially. So this is the type of interview that you probably, without realizing it, you probably have already done this kind of thing. If you've ever been to a barbecue, if you've ever gone to a conference, if you've ever been to a meeting, and I'm sure none of us has ever been to a meeting, or if you've ever gone to lunch with somebody and said, so what do you do? And then the person has given you a job title, and then you come back and say, really, I didn't even know that was a type of job. What's involved in doing that? Whether you realize it or not, you are doing a research interview, in other words, an informational interview. So you've actually all done them already. You just may not realize it. Essentially, when you ask somebody, well, what's that like? How did you get started doing that? You're doing an informational interview. So let's take a look at some other things about what it is. Essentially, because it's a chance to expand your knowledge of your field, it's actually now, it's expected that you will be researching this, your field in this particular way. You should be thinking that you'll be researching the field that you're interested in, your profession, a company that you're interested in, a department or division, a job, even a person that you're going to talk to. It's not unusual for people going to a conference or a meeting where there are people that they haven't met before to look them up on Google or LinkedIn and try to get a little background on them. And the more you can do that before you meet new people, the better off you're going to be. We'll talk about also how to avoid stalking people by revealing that you know too much about them if you stumble on too much information. The other thing is, if you don't do this kind of research, it's going to show, and it will be noticed, and it will not reflect well on you when you actually are in a job interview situation. If you do this kind of research, it will help you to ask great questions, it will help you to make informed choices, and hopefully you will have much less guesswork about your job and career. So the final thing that we want to say about what it is imagine that you're a person who's about to invest a lot of time, a lot of money, maybe a lot of training in a new type of job or a new type of career. And I've talked to a lot of people who have done this, but they've never done informational interviews about the career. So what they have discovered after spending a lot of time, a lot of money, and maybe a lot of training, and they get out into the workforce, some of them have discovered they can't get jobs in that career, or some of them have gotten jobs in the career only to discover that they hate what they're doing. So it's extremely important before you commit to something to test your assumptions, because your assumptions could be wrong, or they could be right, and this is going to be the perfect thing for you. So one of the major arguments for doing this is you want to minimize the risk, and this is one of the best ways that you can minimize risk. So let's talk about what it isn't. This is where a lot of misconceptions come in. So I think the number one misconception about informational interviewing is that it's some form of employment interview. It isn't. So please, if you walk away with nothing else, and I hope you'll walk away with several points from this workshop, but if you walk away with nothing else, it is not a job interview, and it is not a sneaky way to ask for a job, essentially. So imagine that you've been asked by someone who says to you, oh, I'd love to hear what you're doing in your career right now. I'm not looking for a job or anything, but I'm interested in what you do, and I would just like to find out more about it. So you agree to meet the person for coffee, and they start off by asking you a few questions, and then suddenly they say, I know you have a job open. I'm interested in applying for that job. Put yourself in their place. You would really feel manipulated because they told you right off the bat that it isn't, they're not applying for a job, they're just gathering background information, and now suddenly they sort of have your back up against the wall. It is really not a place to expect to be job interviewing. So this is the kind of thing that you do in a background, and you do it before you are ready to job interview. You're doing it to gather research. However, one of the slightly more confusing things about informational interviews is they're not at all casual. You really almost have to treat them in the way that you would treat a job interview. In other words, you don't show up in casual dress and you don't show up in casual attitude. It really is not a casual conversation. We'll talk about how to structure the interview in a little while. But one thing that you don't want to do is wing it. You are the person who asked for the informational interview. We'll get into who does what in the interview in a couple of minutes. But basically, you're expected to be prepared. You're the one who provides the structure for the interview. And you have to keep in mind, if you ask someone for an informational interview, that they cannot read your mind. So you have to go in with a list of prepared questions for them. So this sounds like a lot of work. It is a lot of work on your part. So why in the world should you bother about doing an informational interview? For one thing, it's expected these days. You have to have done your research. But as you can see by the first bullet here, you really can explore and expand your thinking. And in the second bullet, you can explore and expand your job market information as well. You might hear about a whole new direction that you'd never thought of before. You might find out real-life information on who's your competition, what requirements are needed for the job, is this a growing or shrinking career, and what is the actual day-to-day work like. Because you're talking to someone, hopefully, who's doing it and who's rather expert in it. And the final thing is, everyone expects that you will have done this kind of thing. So you need to do your research both online and in person before you launch yourself out into a job hunt. So let's talk about, if it is different from an employment interview, what are those differences? Okay, let's first look at the typical employment interview, and I think we all understand what is about to come up next. In the employment interview, I'm literally going to read this because I think it's very important. They call you, you don't call them. The employer makes the appointment. The employer comes in with a list of questions. At least we hope they'll come in with a list of questions because that allows you to respond effectively, hopefully, and show your stuff in an employment interview. The employer is clearly in charge of the interview. They conduct the interview. It's the employer who draws a conclusion, go or no go, at the end of the interview. And of course, the all-important thing, it's the employer who has an open job. So basically, you're there to apply for that job. An information interview is almost the polar opposite of this. So under this particular column are things that many people do not realize when they set out to do informational interviews, and they come in looking very passive and almost as though they expect to have their minds read. So you really need to switch hats here and put on an entirely different role. So in research interviews, you are the person who makes the first contact. You're the person who's asking for the interview. You're the person who sets up the appointment. But an all-important point that we want to make here, and we'll come back to this later, is you set up the appointment at their convenience, not at your convenience, okay? The third thing is you're the person who needs to ask the questions. So we're going to talk about how do you develop questions later on. But you need to go in with a list of questions. They cannot read your mind about what is it that you want to know. You decide what it is that you need to know, and that helps you to frame the questions. You're the person who's doing the interview. It's the polar opposite of a job interview. You're actually interviewing them. You're drawing your own conclusions, and there is no expectation, and this is a big takeaway, there is no expectation that you're going to get anything other than information to help you in the future, in your career. You are not going in there expecting that you will be hired for a job or applying for a job. So I think one of the mottos here is when you do a research interview, it's wildly different from an employment interview. And essentially what you're doing is you're making like a journalist who's out on assignment researching an article or researching something for, say, a video interview or something like that. So let's talk about how do you prepare. And I think the first thing you need to do is figure out, in the same way that a journalist would if they were researching an article on a particular topic, what facts do I think I know? And do I really know these facts? What's my evidence behind them? What facts do I have, and have I checked them? And then what facts don't I know that I would like to find out? So the first thing that you want to do is do that online research before you call and ask anybody for any favor of an informational interview. Find out as much as you think you can on your own. Do every bit of research that you can on Google, on LinkedIn, etc. I would suggest that you take extensive notes, and I would also suggest that you bring your notes to the interview. Now, I'm not talking about bringing a 3-inch thick binder. That's not what I mean, but I would certainly bring a couple of points. I would have a list of questions, and I would certainly bring those questions in print just from my own eyes. And I would also have a tablet with me, either handwriting or literally an electronic tablet, but I think maybe scribbling might be easier in an interview like this and might enable you to make more eye contact. And I would ask them if it's okay for you to take some notes as you ask your questions. And I think people understand that's going to be fine. One thing I would not expect in an informational interview is to record the interview. If you ask somebody if you can record the interview, you will make them extremely uncomfortable. It's too much pressure on them, and they don't really know what you're going to do with that recording. So back to preparation. I think you need to create a set of interview questions, hopefully a fair number of questions, but you need to be aware that you're not going to ask for a lot of this person's time, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And so you may never get to some of these questions. So before you go in and see this person, you want to prioritize your questions and put the top 3 to 5 right at the top of your tablet, because you may not get to ask every question on your sheet. Then you need to think about, how do these questions sound to someone else? In other words, if your top question is, how much vacation will I get in this job? You're not going to sound particularly impressive to the person. So you really want to think about, why am I asking this question, and how could it be taken by the person that I'm asking? And then finally, you want to spend a little bit of time researching the person that you're hoping to interview on Google or LinkedIn or on the company website. And when you call them and ask for an interview, if they agree, to interview you, they'll probably do the same for you. They'll probably Google your name or look you up on LinkedIn or look you up on your current Harvard website if you're mentioned on there. So this is all the types of preparation that you may want to think about doing. In fact, I would strongly suggest you think about doing. So let's talk about how you would actually go about getting an informational interview. And we'll talk about informational interviews specifically at Harvard a little bit later. But if you don't have a specific name, the first thing to do certainly would be to ask everyone you know, do you know anybody who works at X department or at X company? You can't believe how powerful networking can be, and it's not unusual for you to be able to find a name through your own network. So I would do my research, I would look for news articles, I would look on LinkedIn groups, that sort of thing, and see if you can come up with a name. Then you need to decide what's the best approach to the person. Should you maybe approach them by letter, which is, I think, less and less common these days? Should you try a phone call? That can put the person on the spot if you happen to actually get them on the phone. They may feel like, oh gosh, I have to give you a yes or no answer right now, so I'm going to say no. One of the better ways might be to just try a simple email and craft it very, very carefully. We'll talk about what to say in a minute. Or if you are in a LinkedIn group with them or you're connected to them on LinkedIn, you can approach them via LinkedIn, or you can ask for an introduction through someone else in your network on LinkedIn. So let's take a look at what you would actually say. I would suggest that you script out what you're planning on saying when you ask for an interview. So you want to set a little bit of context for them, who you are, why you're calling, and early on in the contact, if you're not calling, or early on in the email, whether you're calling or emailing, you want to make sure that you're clear that you're not in job hunting mode, that you're researching this field or you're researching this company. So you want to be very, very clear about that. And then you want to ask for a short amount of time. If you're talking with them on the phone or you're writing them via email, you don't want to go on and on and on and on. So you want to be fairly brief. I would ask for, say, 15 minutes. If they come back at you and say, well, I can't give you 15 minutes in person, but we could do it via email or we could do it on the phone, that works great as well. In person is always probably the best, but you can do very effective informational interviews by email or on the phone. My last point here is you need to be really clear when you ask for an informational interview that it's at their convenience. So over the years I've had people send me emails or call me and ask me about informational interviews, and I've had people say things like, would you be available Thursday afternoon at 3:30? Well, not usually. I'm usually pretty programmed pretty far in advance. Or I've had people say, I could talk to you anytime, but not any Thursday this month. So forget about your schedule. You want to ask them what is their schedule, and state that it's at their convenience, and see if you can ask them for maybe a couple of different times that might fit into their schedule, and then you can decide what works for you. The final thing I would say here is don't stalk somebody. So don't take it personally if you don't get a response. If they say no, just move on. People have all kinds of reasons for saying no to these. Sometimes they've had a bad experience in doing these. The person has promised it's just an informational interview, and they get into the meeting and they back the person up against the wall and say, really, I want a job here. So sometimes that will sour people on it, or the person is just plain too busy right then, and you just happen to ask at a bad time, or they don't really understand, even though you've tried to be clear, what it is that you're planning on doing. You're researching your field, or you're researching their kind of work, but they still may not get it, and they may think that you're asking for a job. So there's a million reasons why people will say no. Usually it has to do with time, and just move on if they don't respond to you. Okay, so let's imagine that you get an interview. Now what in the world are you going to do? So again, we're going to go back a little bit to preparation. And so you've done your preparation, so you're going to review your research notes, you're going to look at all your questions. We're actually going to talk about some sample topics shortly. You want to know where you're going, so you want to have checked out the location in advance. You don't want to be a half hour late because you can't find the place or you took the wrong train. You want to plan the meeting structure, so you want to think to yourself, okay, how am I going to set a context for this meeting? When I walk in the room and after we do a minute or so of chit-chat and how was the parking or how was the commute, how am I going to explain to them why I'm there? So you want to have a kind of an opening, brief opening statement. If you're going to take notes, you want to make sure they're comfortable with you taking notes. Most people will be. I would say if you can get there 5 minutes early, that's perfect. It's better than 5 minutes late, which you do not want to do under any circumstances, and it's even better than 15 minutes early because you can make people feel pressured if you arrive too early. So try to time your arrival, even if you have to loiter outside the building for a little bit. And then one of the important things is you really want to, if you ask them for 15 to 20 minutes, you really want to keep a close eye on the time, and you want to really honor that time request. So if after 15 to 20 minutes, and this is not unusual, by the way, they seem to be, happily chatting away and not looking at all concerned about time, when they draw a breath, you need to say to them, I'm just doing a time check here. I realize I asked you for 15 to 20 minutes, and I know I'm very excited about how this is going, but I also realize you might be really busy. I don't know if you have another meeting. If you want to end this right now, I completely understand. And half the time they'll say, oh no, we can go a while longer, and before you know it, you've been in there for a half an hour or something like that. But you do need to make a sincere effort to wrap up at the appointed time, and if they want to extend, that's up to them. Okay, so what do people talk about in informational interviews? And again, we're going back to your kind of journalist role here. You've done some research on either the person or the field or the job or the profession, and you have a bunch of questions, some facts that you want to check out. So some typical sample topics are what kind of work, here's the kind of work I think is in this particular field. Am I right about this? You might turn up a whole new kind of type of job that you weren't even aware is emerging in the field, and that can be very exciting. Then you want to do your real-life check on what does this person who's actually working in the field have to say about the actual requirements. So how strict are they about the requirements when they look for people in the field? Where's there a little wiggle room in terms of skills, knowledge, and experience? Who's your competition likely to be? What about the coursework that you might or might not have to take, or a certification that you might or might not have to get? How much experience do they really expect to see, and what kind of experience do they really expect to see? And you should have researched all these things first, and then double check your facts when you get into the interview. So then you want to talk about whether or not they view the field as growing or shrinking, or what kinds of trends they see coming up, or what's the sort of the biggest pain points in the field, what's happening, what's a hot topic in the field right now. You want to ask about typical titles, who reports to whom, anything you need to know about the organizational structure. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing you wouldn't want to ask, you wouldn't expect necessarily that you would have questions on every single one of these bullets. Some of them may not be relevant to what you need to know. Finally, a particular initiative or project, if you've noticed, if you've read a news article on a particular project that's just gotten funded, or a particular kind of research they're really famous for doing, and you want to ask about that in particular, go right ahead. This is your chance to do it. So as I said, you might not have a question in every one of these categories, and you might have totally other categories that you might want to add questions in. That's why this says sample topics. So it's not like we expect you to go down the page and take this literally. So now you're in the interview, you're working along, and surprise, surprise, something happens that you really don't expect. So let's take a look at some of the surprises that happen. They don't show up, or they arrive, 20 minutes, you asked for 20 minutes, and they arrive at the 20-minute time point where you thought you'd be ending. So I have three things that I would recommend if this happens. The number one thing is, no matter how mad you might be or irritated, your number one thing is to be gracious. Your number two thing is to be positive, no sarcastic remarks, no eye rolling, no anything like that. Be gracious, be positive, and then the third thing is offer to reschedule. The second thing that has happened that I've seen many times is they do show up on time and they bring people you have no idea who these people are. They bring other people that you didn't expect to the meeting. This is not at all unusual. So again, the number one thing, be totally gracious, and just make sure you get the names correct for the people who are coming into the meeting. Sometimes more is better. You can get more information faster with more people. Another common thing is you have come in with your list of well thought out questions, you ask your first question, and the person never shuts up. You cannot get a word in edgewise, they don't even seem to be breathing, they're just kind of sailing along, and you can't get your second question in, and maybe they're repeating themselves, and at some point, what I would say is everyone's going to have to take a breath at some point, and that's when you can jump in, and again, you want to be gracious, even if you're really annoyed. So your first comment would be something like, oh, this is so useful. May I ask you a question about, and then ask your next question. See if you can steer them on to that next question. A lot of times people will say, well, they asked me for a resume when I was in the informational interview. What do you think that means? Very possibly it means nothing. It's very common for people to ask for a resume, so I would suggest you bring one with you, but you not volunteer it, because it's a little ambivalent or ambiguous, I guess I should say, if you walk into the room and hand them your resume. The pretty obvious message is, I'm looking for a job, and you just said you weren't doing that. So I would have it in my briefcase or in my folder, and if they ask for it, I would say, sure, I've got one here, and bring it out. Usually all it signifies is they just want to get a quick snapshot view of you and what you've done. Just so that they kind of know how to pitch what they're saying. It doesn't always, in fact, it doesn't usually mean anything more than that. So don't expect anything from that if it happens. And then finally, it's not unusual or unheard of that you start off doing an informational interview and then suddenly you're beginning to get the impression that they're turning this around and they're interviewing you. And you begin to get the impression that they may be thinking of you for something, and they may be recruiting you for a particular job. I would never go in expecting this, but you should be prepared. You should know what's on your resume. You should be able to talk about what's on your resume. And if it happens, great. But it doesn't, even if you think this is what's going on, you may never hear anything from them about a potential job in the future. So do not expect anything from this. I think you really have three goals for doing one of these interviews. One is to get better information for yourself so you can make better informed career decisions. Your second goal is to meet somebody and leave a good impression with them. And your third goal is to meet somebody, leave a good impression, and add the person to your network after you leave. And we'll talk about follow-up and how to do that. So go on to the, yep, thank you. So one thing that people forget commonly when they do informational interviews is they just leave and get back on the T or get back on their bike or walk home, and that's it. And then they think about it, but it's unbelievably easy to forget many of the things that you've just learned. So my suggestion would be go for coffee immediately. Go out to a cafe, find someplace quiet, pull out your tablet that you've been taking notes on. It's just too easy to forget what you've learned. So the first thing that you want to do, and please don't do this before you even leave the building, let a couple of hours go by, but you do want to send a thank you note to the person. After all, they donated their time. Even if you walk away thinking, well, that was a complete waste of time, I didn't learn anything I didn't know before, and I didn't even like the person, it doesn't matter. They still donated their time to you. So it's important for you to immediately send them a thank you. And again, when I say immediately, I've actually seen people walking out of the person's office, hitting send on a thank you note, that's too soon. But, I would let an hour or two go by and maybe email a thank you. Or if you think they're the kind of person who you have the distinct impression they would appreciate an actual physical note, then I would do that and get that in the mail to them ASAP. Okay, go ahead, Charlie. So there is a good list of follow-up items that you need to think about. You want to sit down and read over your notes from the interview or make notes from the interview. And then you want to look at the list of questions and you want to edit your questions so that the next informational interview you will sound even more educated and even more informed. And you can say to that next person, I've heard in a couple of other research interviews that I've done that XYZ is a common requirement for this field. What's your thinking on this? And it makes you look great, it makes you sound great, and you're double-checking your facts as well. So think about what you need to verify and how you need to verify it. What do you need to do to follow up? And what do you need to do to organize your results for action? And that gets us onto the next slide. So you don't need to copy this down because we actually have a PDF that we're going to post with the recording of this webinar. But these are the typical kinds of things that you would want to debrief when you're thinking about that interview. So you want to make sure you've got correct contact information for the person. And if the person has an assistant, you want to make sure your correct contact information includes the assistant's contact information. You want to make sure that if the person was kind enough to give you any referrals, that you have gotten your information straight about who did they refer you to and why, okay? If the person gave you any suggestions, then you want to make sure that you write down what they were and whether or not you're planning on following up on those, and if so, how. These are all notes for yourself, by the way. Then you want to look at or think through the whole interview and ask yourself, how can I make my next informational interview better? Are there things that I wish I had gotten asked that I didn't? And now I'm really curious about them. What would I do differently in the next informational interview? And then you have 3 to-dos at the bottom of this. So what exactly did you agree to send them? If you perhaps said to them, oh, I've got an article on that I think you'd like, I can send it to you. What did you promise them, if anything? What do you need to follow up with? What kinds of deadlines would be appropriate? And if you send your thank you note, when and how, when and where, and you want to make sure you have a record of that also. Did you want to show the PDF, Charlie? Can we
if
do
you'd
that?
like. Sure. So as Devin mentioned, we've created a PDF that will walk you through a lot of these debrief type questions, things to think about after the informational or research interview is over. You can take a look at it right here, just some basic concepts. All of this information, this PDF, will be available online on the harvey.harvard.edu website under Watch and Learn. Probably it'll be up in the next day or so, so you can check that certainly next week.
Okay, great. So let's go back to our slides and go on to the next one.
There you
go. So what about getting informational interviews here at Harvard? I would say it's tough right now. And that's simply because of the volume of applicants that we have for jobs, and that keeps HR hopping, basically. I'm not assuming that you only want an informational interview with HR, but that's a common place to start. So one thing I would say is you can check the school website for their HR office, and if the HR officers are mentioned by name, then it's perfectly okay to call or email them to ask for an informational interview. But get yourself together before you do, write a script, think about how you're going to introduce yourself, what you're going to say, all the stuff that we've talked about. If you want to interview in a department, one thing I would say is many hiring managers have no idea what you're talking about when you call up. You might do better by calling it a research interview if you're talking to a manager. I probably shouldn't say hiring manager because that implies they might have a job open, and you don't want to be asking for an informational interview when someone has a job open that they think you might be trying to get. I'll come back to that in a minute. But anyway, many managers have no idea what this is, and so you really have to set a context for them if you're going to talk with them. The other thing I would say is I would do a few safe interviews first. Don't start at the top. It's not always wise to start at the top anyway, but don't try to do a research interview with the dean of the school as your first informational interview. First of all, why are you talking to that person? Is that the right person? But secondly, if you're going to be talking to a heavy hitter like that, you want to be sure you know what you're doing. You've had some practice. You've done a few of these interviews, so don't start at the top. Do some easier ones first. Any kind of research that you can do will help you to get names. And the last point here that I'm coming back to is if the person you want to interview has a current job open, my suggestion would be don't even try it right then. I would say wait until the job has been filled because, again, I can't emphasize this enough. This is not a sneaky way of getting a job interview. It is something totally, totally different. And remember, you can't stalk people. So if you've asked a couple of people for an informational interview and they don't get back to you, no response is a response, and you just are really going to have to move on and work your network and see who else would be helpful to you in an interview. So let's take a look at some things that you should never do, but which we commonly have seen people do. So don't make assumptions about getting a meeting. Just because you work here, for example, doesn't mean that everybody at Harvard would be willing to do an informational interview with you. They just might, frankly, not have the time this week or this month or this year. So don't make assumptions about getting the meeting. It's a big favor for someone to do this. Don't make any assumptions about the person you're interviewing, about the field that you're investigating. After all, making assumptions about the field you're investigating, that's why you're doing the interview to begin with, is to check your assumptions. So you want to ask. It's too easy to miss the place, to think you knew the bus route or to think you knew the right road to take, and then you find out there's construction and suddenly you're half an hour late. So double check your time and place. And then the last piece on this, Charlie, I think is, and this is one that a lot of people forget. They'll go out and they'll do one informational interview and then they'll say, okay, this really verified what I thought. It's never safe to do just one. I would say you've got to do at least 3 with 3 different people, and then you've got to do your own research to double check what you're hearing. You might hear 3 different things from 3 different people, and that could be very discouraging. On the other hand, it's going to save you a lot of time and money if you discover that not everybody is on the same page with, how to get into this field or what people actually do in the field or whether it's a growing or shrinking field. You need to know if there's a lot of controversy. You need to know that in advance. So this can actually be useful, even if it can be temporarily discouraging. Some other things that you want to avoid at all costs, and I think we've covered this one, overstay. This next one, you can't believe it, but people do this all the time in interviews. They actually get into verbal arguments. Never, never, never. Your number one thing to do is to be gracious and positive. Just ask exploratory questions. If you completely disagree with what the person is telling you, your script tells you that you should say, oh, I see, thank you, and then move on, okay? Just move on. Don't argue with the person. You can ask questions, but don't ask sarcastic questions, accusatory questions. Just say, oh, I see, thank you, and move on. Okay, you don't want to get into chit-chat so deeply that essentially you're turning it into a social call. It is really not a social call. You can do chit-chat, that's great. Everybody needs to do that to kind of grease the wheels when they start something up, but just for a couple of minutes usually. Don't show up without any plan or any structure. You're going to be making them do all the work, and believe me, they will resent you for it like you won't believe, and you will sink down in their estimation and not do your reputation any good. And finally, don't forget to send a thank you. Whether it was helpful or not, they donated their time to you, and you really owe them a big thank you. A lot of times people are intimidated by the idea of doing these. They think, oh gosh, it's just too much to ask. But imagine if somebody said to you, hey, could I take you out to coffee and ask you, what's it like to work at the ed school, or what's it like to work at Genzyme, or it would be a very easy thing for you to do. It's not that big a deal unless the person is imposing on you in some way, shape, or form.
I definitely want to say on that, Devin, the number one question I see a lot of the time is, do I really have to send a thank you note? And my response to that is, well, no, you don't. But on the other hand, the people who do will get better results.
Absolutely.
I mean, absolutely. I've been in that role, the hiring manager role myself, where I, interviewed a dozen people, and 3 or 4 of them sent me thank you notes. Those went up in the pile,
yep.
And the ones that didn't. Yep.
You
got to remember, it's worth noting, especially we were talking about informational interviewing at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
At Harvard, there's on average 50 applicants for every single job opening, and that's the average. Some will be much higher than that.
Right.
So anything that you can do to make yourself stand out is worth it.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone asks me, do I really need to send a thank you note, I think the answer is yes.
Absolutely.
It's the best way to stand out.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Thank you for that testimonial. All right, so let's take a look at our last slide here, which is additional resources. I love the Quint Careers site. It's really a great site. It's very rich, and this particular site or this particular URL that we're giving you is a really great article on informational interviewing. Now, please don't be scared when you go to it because it is so unbelievably long, but it is, can I use the word chapterized? In other words, it's chopped up into very short, like single screen or just 2-screen chapters, and all the chapters are well titled. So you don't have to read the whole thing. You can just go straight to the piece that you want to read and focus on that, and probably in 3 to 5 minutes you can get what you need out of the site. The other thing I want to add is if you go to the external if you're looking for an informational interview at Harvard and you want to talk to an HR person, and you go to the external portal on the Harvard Employment website and click on I think career development or careers there. On the Aspire site where you go to look for jobs, there is a list of I don't think every, but most of the school HR offices, and you can click on that list and just see if you can get a list of who's who in those offices. The more names they list, probably the more open they are to doing informational interviews. Some of our schools are so overwhelmed with trying to cope with the number of applications that come through for jobs that they literally don't have time in the HR office to do an informational interview. But it never hurts to ask. So I would say always ask. The worst they can do is either not respond or say no. Never hurts to ask. Just get yourself together carefully before you ask, and be prepared to set a context, introduce yourself well, and be clear that you're not looking for a job, you're just doing research on your career. So we are actually done with our webinar for the moment in terms of content, and we'd love to see questions. Charlie, do you want to...
So if anybody has any questions they would like to submit, this is a great time to do it. We'll be here for a few more minutes, but otherwise that's the end of our presentation. So if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll be happy to answer them. So we did just get a couple of questions coming in. First question, Devin, is it ever too late to send the thank you note?
Probably not. I think I'll qualify that just a little bit. I mean, if it's a year later, then sure, yeah. But, if you, for some reason or other, you forgot and a month has gone by, I would still, I'm thinking about how I would react. I would be surprised not to get a thank you note. A month goes by, I would be surprised to suddenly get a thank you note. And I would think, oh, that's kind of the person, especially if the thank you note said something like, I took your advice on XYZ, or I did contact the person that you suggested I contact, and things are going along very well. I will keep you posted on my progress. Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful interview. A month later, okay, you took your time, not great, but better than nothing. So I would say absolutely send it. More questions?
I'd say after a month, you'd want to think about rephrasing it as a, follow-up letter rather than as a thank you, direct
Right.
thank you note.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But you would include a big thank you in
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Next question. Someone wanted you to repeat the path to find the
Oh,
list
yes.
of HR reps.
Yeah, I probably wasn't too clear.
That's
so
okay.
if you want to find the HR reps, then you would go to, let's see, harvard.edu. You'd click on, or put in the search menu there, jobs or employment. So you're going to the external employment site. I hope you all know, if you're a Harvard employee, that there are two employment sites. There's one for externals and there's one for internals. When you apply for a job, you always want to go to the internal website because jobs are listed sooner for internals there. But if you want to find the HR offices, first of all, you can try going to the individual schools, or you can go to the external employment website. And there is, I believe, a 3-column sort of set of pictures in the middle of that website, and the middle one says something like career development. If you click on that, you will see somewhere on that page a list of most of the HR offices at the university with URLs to each one, and you can just click on those. So I hope that's a little bit more clear.
I'd say probably the quickest way to find out, I would think if you Google employment at Harvard,
That
I
would
think
work.
that should lead you there.
Good. That's great. Yeah.
Next question. I do not have a specific idea of what I want to do. Can I do informational interviews asking how my qualifications and requirements would fit into a given field or company, and how? Trickier.
That's a good question. Yeah. You know, what I would say is I would research the heck out of that company or field and try to at least eliminate all the things that you know you wouldn't be interested in doing, and maybe bring in 3 or 4 areas that interest you. And then I would do the informational interview on those 3 or 4 areas. And again, I wouldn't try starting at the top. I would try to figure out, do I know anybody at this company who's relatively safe that I could start out talking with that person? But I do think that the more specific you can be, the better. Charlie, you had something.
Yeah, I'd also say that the tricky part of that is that I think the person that would be the best target for a research interview is someone who's currently in the role that you would see yourself in say 5 years down the line.
Yeah.
So not necessarily like the entry-level position, but where you might want to go. So to figure out who that is, you kind of at least have to have an idea of what it is you want to be doing.
Yeah.
That said, if you're looking at a large organization like, say, Harvard University, I could see a scenario where you might contact the HR office and say, I think your school does really fantastic work, does a lot of really interesting things. I'd like to find out, how I might be able to fit in. Can I do a research interview with someone in human resources? And that might be able to work.
I think that would work, but in that case, you've sort of identified the school as an interest area, and so it's not like you're completely clueless about what you're thinking about there. So I think that would work, but probably more with an HR person than with someone in the actual...
Right, if you have no idea, I think you'd be wanting to look at career service support areas instead.
Yeah.
Next question. I have some contacts that may be good candidates for an informational interview. Is it okay to say something like, can we meet for coffee? I'd like to get together and ask you about the work in your department.
Absolutely, but you buy the coffee, if possible, yes.
Next one. I have applied for several requisitions or job openings at the university. Should I do informational interviews with HR people from different schools? So they're applying already for different things. I think there you have to be careful once you've already started applying.
You do have to be careful. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, then you're saying that you've applied, say, at school A, and maybe school B, but you're thinking about doing informational interviews at school D and E. That's probably okay.
Yeah, informational interviews at places you haven't applied to.
Right.
But once you have applied, you're sort of past that stage.
Yep. And is she coming back with another?
This is, I think, possibly a clarification. I've applied for several requisitions. Should I do informational interviews with HR people? Yeah, that's just the same thing.
Okay.
As an internal job seeker, what kind of information would I be looking for from an interview with an internal HR person? So how are things different for internals versus externals?
Well, are you internal to the school, to that same school, and you'd be interviewing with the HR person
Let's
in
start
your
with that, yeah.
school? So I think you'd probably want to go to the person with your ambitions, essentially. You know, I'm interested in doing this or that within this school.
Mm-hmm.
What would I need? And I'm going to make a big assumption here. What would I need to move up? So my assumption is you're thinking about moving up within the school. What would I need to do to move up within the school? What kinds of jobs are at a higher level? What skills and talents would I need to do that? What experience would I need? How about my current experience? How would that be viewed within the school? All those kinds of questions.
It's also worth remembering that many HR officers across the university sit on committees or go to meetings with other HR officers from other schools. So you might want to consider, depending on what you're looking for, you know, letting them know that you're looking for something and asking if they know of other places that would be good, other contacts.
Yep.
What resume builders that you might want to build up so that before you applied to things at other schools. It's another good thing to think about.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, they're afraid of coming across as too chatty in research interviews. How do you try to relax? That's a problem I know I have.
Right. I think a lot of us have this problem, as you've all listened to me chat like crazy for the last 45 minutes. So one thing I would say is go in with a good list of questions, and it's not that you can't say anything, but focus on your questions. And the second thing I would say is don't stress yourself out by going in and talking to the big cheese first. You know, practice a couple of these with people who are kind of low risk for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And once you've done a couple of them, you kind of get into the rhythm and you understand how they're done, and it becomes much easier to be professional and business-like.
Sure. And as you said earlier, Devin, I think one of the keys there is to prepare. Preparation. Create a list of the questions that you want to ask and prioritize them.
Yeah.
That will help you keep your focus, especially if you set yourself like a 15-20 minute time limit.
Right.
You know, you want to make sure you hit those top 4 priority questions.
Right, and if you hear yourself talking during the informational interview, you're not getting information, you're giving information, and is that what you want to be doing? So again, refocus on your questions.
Sure. Someone says that they're in layoff status currently. How will informational interviewing benefit them if they're already searching for jobs?
Well, if you are informational interviewing in your field at places that you're not applying to, then you're just getting smarter and better at handling interviews in your field, at informing yourself about your field. I think the trick for you, if you are actively interviewing, is to not be research interviewing or informational interviewing at places where you're likely to be applying as well. And actually that can be very informative because, you know, maybe you never want to work for Boston Scientific, but you're going to do a couple of informational interviews there. That is really going to inform you about your field in general. And, you know, you can then go into an employment interview and say, you know, I was talking to someone at Boston Scientific the other day, and they said X, Y, Z. What do you think about that? So that looks really great. In a job interview, you look like you're doing your research.
Sure.
That's what you want to do.
And just to expand on that, I mean, finding out about current trends in the industry, even with companies that you might not want to work for, is a great way to increase your awareness and make yourself look like a better candidate for something that you are coming in for, because you show that awareness.
The other thing I would add on this is you might really surprise yourself. In fact, you might even shock yourself. You might do an informational interview at a company that you basically said, I would never work for this company, and when you get in there and do the informational interview and get home, you think, oh my gosh, I really enjoyed that. I really might consider working for that company someday. So you might really, you might come out of there with a lot more information than you even thought you would.
Sure. So I think we're just about wrapped up here. I'll hold it on a minute if someone has any other last questions to ask. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us. And thanks, everybody. Good luck with your interviews. Good luck with job searches if you're moving on to that stage. And keep your eye out for future sessions that we might be doing. As I mentioned, we did record this session and we will be posting it to the Watch and Learn area of harvey.harvard.edu. So keep a look there, and we'll also include the PDF of that debrief document that we're recommending. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.